Man had produced a system so complex that he was incapable of stepping back to survey it. It was so ingrained he could not release it, so instead he relied on it like a drug. He had brought everything to bear, all else was sacrificed, so that even were he to attempt to step away, to do so would mean his own extinction. Thus he continued, for he knew no other way. Past a certain point, he could not stop the movement he had started. In time, nature could no longer support him. Her diversity was diminished, the structure of her own system of reliance was broken. Man had superseded the balance that nature had created over hundreds of millions of years. He had seen himself as wiser, he had acted without regard for the repercussions of his actions. He had failed to see how his own seeking affected the very world on which he relied. And he had done all of this based on a flawed idea that he had created and clung to and never released. An idea of faith that allowed him to act aside from his own reason, to act not only to his own detriment, but also to the detriment of millions of other life forms. It was an idea that existed on the basis of his own careless view of self-importance, a view that he could do as he liked, as all would be forgiven. Torunn saw that man had not been, in some sense, far from the truth. He had seen to an extent his own insignificance, and he had seen again to an extent his own significance. He had recognized the enormity of powers outside of himself, and in those powers he had recognized a core system of positive traits that had in fact guided him. Man's most valuable jewel was his kernel of wisdom and understanding, and he had placed it into the care of managers who shifted and recreated man's understanding so as to benefit themselves and their designs. In time, these managers monopolized the comprehension of life's will. They insisted on the goodness of simple belief, that it was faith that would allow the passage to enlightenment. The acceptance of this insistence was the cornerstone that allowed the perpetuation of controlling doctrines, regardless of their relevance to truth. Fundamental to the persuasion of the doctrine was the concept of the forgiving God. Misapplied for purposes of control, this concept allowed for the perpetuation of all of man's many faults. It was one of the greatest instances of man's carelessness. He allowed himself to believe that his fear of God could be appeased through service to the very institution that perpetuated his fear. In his ignorance, man saw himself as created in the image of God, but by so portraying himself, he had actually applied the image of man to God, so that man's careless traits, his fallibilities, could be more easily forgiven. Nothing could have been more damaging to man's evolution, but more importantly, a side effect arose in time. Not only did man's belief allow him to impede his own evolution, it was so powerful that it would come to destroy the world around him. It would conflict with his understanding of need. Man, like any being, was a consumer. Within the tight parameters of his survival, within a world of forces far beyond his control, his consumption could only ever be limited. But as his world changed, as he gained his footing against competitors, his needs would change faster than his understanding of life. His instinct to consume would remain strong, but tied to the structure of his belief, it would prove to be unbridled. His rapacious appetite was not even considered something for which he should seek forgiveness. The power that controlled was not the will of God, but the will of the ideological descendants of those who had initially created the doctrines in order to satisfy their own thirst for power. Man's thirst would never be quenched. He would consume without seeing the true repercussions of his actions. He had been convinced of the right of his consumption. He believed in it. In this way, man would ruin himself. He had developed a comprehension of some of the very traits and understandings that would have brought him beyond his misery, and yet he had corrupted even that. And so the very misery that remained with him throughout his existence would soon come to rule him, to lead him to his own destruction. He would perish in a cold, barren world devoid of the very life that had ever sustained him, a world of life that had brought him joy he could never replace through his own artificial devices. In fact, in his jealous drive to promote his own desires, it was his very life, his very human existence that he had relinquished.